Alex Dietrick. I'm a graduate student at LMU in Munich, Germany, and I'm working on African Drosera. And I just wanted to share a lot of the things I've been finding this year. I spent a lot of time in Burundi, Tanzania, and Angola. And so I'm going to go through some of the highlights from these trips here. I'm going to jump right into it because I have a lot to show you guys. And as usual, these trips start in the herbarium. And so the first trip I went on this year was to Burundi. And I've been wanting to get to Burundi for about 4 years now because of these guys. There's just so many strange herbarium specimens that have been collected in Burundi. And so I identified six potentially undescribed species from these herbarium specimens, and these gave me um, rough guidelines on where to go in Burundi. To start off, I emailed somebody who was studying sphagnum, who had traveled to Burundi. So this was a African sphagnum specialist, and I asked him one, how was Burundi getting around and who he collaborated with, but also if he saw any of these plants. And he sent me this photo. And so I was able to line those up with two of my herbarium specimens. So this green one on the left and this red round lamina species on the right. And he was super helpful and connected me with Dr. Joel and Ishime at the University of Burundi. And Joel arranged everything from the research permits to the transport so that we could collaborate on these species descriptions together. And he took me to our first site, which was a high elevation, enormous sphagnum bog in the highlands of central West Burundi. So this was near a village called Agenda, and it was a huge drainage system. You could see where they're even extracting peat, that big pile of peat on the right. There's a lot of agriculture in this area. Sphagnum covered pretty much the entire bog. It was pretty spectacular to see. Um, and in that sphagnum, I found the first species I was looking for, which was this Drosera madagascariensis relative with really round laminas. And once I was able to see these in person, it was clear that I'd seen this one before. I actually saw it in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, in Pemba National Park and Kundalungu National Park. Um, and so this wasn't new to me, still undescribed, but I was able to sort this one out from my herbarium specimens. And it was just super abundant in this really unique habitat. I've never really seen anything quite like this, where it was just open sphagnum for the entire bog. It grew with some lentibulariaceae, so this small form of Utricularia livida grew in the drainage uh, troughs that they were cutting through the peat in order to drain the wetlands so that they could use it for agriculture. Utricularia appendiculata, which twines around the grasses, which is really unique. Genlisea subglabra was really common there at that site. And that green species. And once I was able to get out here and see enough of these guys, um, it was pretty clear that these things weren't undescribed. It was actually Drosera curvipes, which wasn't even on my radar for being an option for this species, because Drosera curvipes, before this was found, was endemic to South Africa and Eswatini, so really the southern tip of Africa. So this was an enormous, really bizarre range extension. And so Burundi up there at the top, following the East African highlands. And then the closest known population is that above Pretoria in South Africa. So really bizarre distribution. This was another plant at that bog that I was able to align to one of those herbarium specimens. And interestingly, all of the specimens at this bog were sterile. And so I'm thinking this was a hybrid actually between Drosera curvipes and that round laminate species. So I wasn't doing too great here in Burundi. One of my new species turned out to be uh, Hervipes, old news, seen it. One of my new species turned out to be a hybrid, and then the other species was new but not new. I had seen this one in DRC, so I set my sights on the other three that I had a lot less of a chance to find. So these other three species hadn't been photographed ever. And they were known from the lowlands, which was a lot more cultivated out. There's hardly any habitat. Um, in fact, the hardest thing about looking for these guys wasn't finding the right habitat, it was finding any remotely wild place to search for Drosera. Um, Before I headed to the lowlands, I did a quick climb out up Mount Munini to see this guy, Drosera pilosa, which is a really rarely observed species, probably due to its habitat, always above 1,800 meters, really high elevation, really miserable mountain climbs. It's a tiny species and it's named for its really pilose inflorescences. And so I headed from central West Burundi down to the lowlands in the east near Ruigi to look for the last three species. And the first place I stopped was Gitega, where there was a single specimen um, of a Drosera elongata relative. This was a really challenging place to look for plants. Again, all these wetlands are completely cultivated from the very edge to edge. So finding a scrap of habitat was really challenging. And in fact, near Gitega, I could only identify one place that wasn't cultivated that we could get to. And so I had one shot to find this plant. When we got to the site, it was actively being plowed. In fact, these villagers that we talked to said that they'd be done plowing it by the end of the year. And so this trip to Burundi was, it felt pretty urgent because of the rate this habitat was disappearing. But in this one tiny fragment, we were able to find around 100 plants of this undescribed species. So really closely related to Elongata and Drosera catongensis, um, a different uh, pubescence on the stem and the leaves and the scapes, and probably one of the most critically endangered species in tropical Africa, just due to habitat loss. And there's that herbarium specimen that I was looking for. And so I was able to find that guy. I was able to collect a tiny amount of seed um, just to uh, get it into cultivation and safe. But for this guy, it's probably not a matter of if it goes extinct, but when, just due to the amount of habitat loss. And that's the fate for a lot of these species that grow in lowlands in tropical Africa. Um, I was looking for another species near Ruyigi, and we couldn't find any habitat near Ruyigi that was remotely intact. And so, although all the specimens were collected in a little bit lower elevations, I went up this mountain pass to see if we could find any seepages. We found one single seepage in these mountains near Ruyigi at about 1,100 meters, and we found the one we were looking for. So this is probably one of my favorites that I've ever found. I just love the leaf shape. And it's, again, probably one of the most critically endangered species in tropical Africa. It's only known from Burundi. Um, I was able to find two populations. These are the only two known populations, and the first time this thing has been photographed. Neither of the populations are in protected areas. Both of them are on the roadside, on vertical seepages. It's just a really beautiful species with a unique habitat. Hopefully, eventually, somebody finds it in neighboring Tanzania, which is, um, at least on the north end, a little more intact than Burundi. I wouldn't be surprised. Right now, this is a Burundi endemic. And there's our herbarium specimen. So I was able to um, match that up, which left me with this guy. Um, this was one that I especially wanted to find. That leaf shape is so unique. And I spent 2 days running around the vague locations and couldn't find anywhere remotely suitable to check. Um, the place it was collected is totally trashed. Burundi's an extremely poor country, and so every bit of land is used for agriculture. Um, and so I was kind of spiraling out about this species. Stayed up late one night and kind of had an epiphany that I'd actually already seen this guy somewhere else. Um, this was a photo I took at Apemba National Park in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And at the time that I took this photo, I thought this was Drosera catongensis. Um, this was about 5 years ago that I took this, and it had erect, really hairy scapes, and it was shorter than Drosera catongensis, but back then, 5 years ago, I really thought these species had more potential to be variable. Um, and the more time I'm spending out in the field, the more I'm finding that these species really aren't that variable at all. And when you look at the type specimen, Drosera catongensis, you find it a lot taller of a plant. Um, and so I kind of eliminated my Drosera catongensis rediscovery, um, which brought me to my next country, which was Tanzania. And so in Tanzania, I landed in Dar es Salaam and drove all the way across the country to what they call the Southern Highlands near Mbeya. And the first town at the end of the arrow that I stopped at was called Sumbawanga. And there was a record of a Drosera collected there, and I wasn't extremely hopeful. Um, Tanzania, besides the remote far north, is like Burundi, extremely cultivated out. This was the site for the record, and I could already see horses in the fields, the cows that decimate an area pretty quickly. There was a cornfield north of the pin, and they were draining the wetland, irrigating it for the cornfields. And so the chances of finding this thing were pretty slim. I was only able to find um, probably around a dozen plants hanging on in some clumps of taller grasses that weren't grazed or trampled. Um, the hydrology of the site was completely changed, as well as probably the nutrient availability just due to the cattle and the other livestock. And so around a dozen plants of Drosera catongensis. Um, so a first for me. And you can really see when you look at this thing compared to the type specimen that it's a perfect match. At this site, I also found probably my favorite Utricularia from Africa, which is Utricularia pentadactyla. So named after those five lobes um, in that corolla. And it's so rarely seen, probably again, because it's a high elevation annual. So this was at around 2,000 meters. So maybe the third time this plant has been photographed. My next site was a private farm in on the Katulo Plateau in the Kipengiri Mountains. And the records here weren't from herbarium specimens, but from photos I've been sent over the years from Andrea Bianchi, who's been working in Tanzania, and also David Moyer, who owns a farm up in the mountains there. And he bought the farm to conserve terrestrial orchids, and at the same time, of course, conserved all the Drosera that were sharing that habitat. Google Maps doesn't work extremely well in rural tropical Africa. And so what was supposed to be a 2.5 hour drive turned into an 11-hour drive from Mbeya over the Katulo Plateau to the farm. Um, it looked like a pretty okay dirt road from the satellite imagery, um, but I didn't even have four-wheel drive. This was botany on a budget. And so for this section, I was totally sliding down this hill. I can't even tell you what I did to this rental car because I don't want to be on the record for this rental car company. But ultimately, I got stuck at this in this village at the foot of this mountain, um, and ultimately had to take a motorbike the next day to the top of the mountain, which was a first for me. But once I got to the top, um, just a really unique, pristine landscape, thanks to the really great stewardship of the Moyer family. And this was the highest I've ever looked for Drosera in Africa. So we're at about 2,800 meters at this point. And it was a really unique habitat. There's some giant lobelias, which are kind of an emblem of the East African highlands. And in this seepage, I found this guy, which is one of the many new species um, from this area, little green rosette related to Drosera madagascariensis. There were also some rockier areas that were really cool, kind of reminding me of like a Tepui landscape. And in these areas, Drosera were really abundant, where they didn't have to compete with the grasses. And so this species in particular, also undescribed, was really abundant. Kind of looks like Drosera communes from South America. And so they're always pretty stemless, really short and compact. And it grew with this cool thing. Um, this guy, I've never seen collected in herbaria or anywhere else. The only site I know is this private property in the Kipengiri Mountains. Hopefully, it exists somewhere else. Um, and this guy, as maybe boring as it looks, is probably the coolest species in tropical mainland Africa from an evolutionary perspective. And that's all I can say at this point about that. I don't want to spoil that. Um, but this boring rosette is pretty cool. And it grew in this really awesome habitat with these um, Lycopodiaceae. When they were growing wetter and not on those um, kind of clayish rock faces, they were a lot bigger. They were really impressive. And that was just a really stunning place. The orchids in these highlands are targeted for chikonda, which is a um, kind of a bread made from the orchid root or tuber. And so almost indiscriminately, they collect orchids, dizas, habanerias for these tubers. And the Moyer family actually has full-time um, security on the farm to intercept orchid poachers poaching for this local um, chikonda. And the chikonda uh, are mainly consumed in Zambia. And so they take these tubers and then they export them south to Zambia. And it's really causing a huge problem for terrestrial orchids in the entire region, Zambia especially. And now, because of the scarcity of these terrestrial orchids in Zambia, the market is moving to neighboring Tanzania and DRC. Third place I visited this year was Angola, and this was an enormous trip. For the last 5 years, if anybody asked me what my number one place I'd like to get to, it would be Angola. And that's just because there are so many strange herbarium specimens coming out of Angola. Um, 9 out of 10 specimens I couldn't put a name on. And it's a huge country, extremely diverse habitats. Um, a huge elevational gradient from lowland tropical savanna, like 700, 800, 900 meters, all the way up to 2,200-meter highland plateau. This central area, especially that green, um, is the BA plateau, about 1,500 meters. So a lot of amazing habitats. And this country has an interesting, complicated political history. There was a civil war that lasted until 2002. And so during the Civil War, both sides laid a lot of landmines. Um, Hundreds of thousands of landmines still exist in Angola. And this is kind of bittersweet. On one side, locals aren't able to farm much to produce food to sustain themselves and grow their economy. Um, and the flip side of that is that this is easily the most intact country in tropical Africa as far as habitat goes because of that threat of landmines. And so I planned some crazy expedition here. Um, I wish I could see my mouse, but I can't. On the east side there, um, I wanted to go to Sarimo, which is this kind of lowland 900-meter area where there's some really weird herbarium specimens that have been collected. And I would do that leg alone. And then the rest of that leg, I had some friends join me. And so Fernando Rivadavia, Noah Juvie, Damien Jawan, William Way, we um, went from Luanda down to Monongwe to Lubongo, and then Noah and I continued up to the DRC border. But I didn't want to drag these guys to Sarimo. If you Google anything about traveling to Angola, it says, yeah, pretty much the whole place is kind of sketchy, but especially don't go to Sarimo, which is always kind of overstated. But Sarimo is kind of the centralized area where the diamond mining industry happens. And so with diamond mining comes black market diamond trade and um, all kinds of criminal activities associated with that. It's just not the safest area for foreigners um, to get to. But there were some pretty cool herbarium specimens coming out of that area pre-war. And so I flew to Sarimo alone. I had no contacts there. It was really difficult to arrange. I ended up finding a cab driver on Facebook who, when I landed to in Sarimo. He ended up not having a cab. He was not a cab driver. And so we had to hire a cab driver on top of that. I ended up having to pay 3 different people um, in Sarimo. But flying to Sarimo from Rwanda was really incredible, especially being after being in Burundi and Tanzania, where I couldn't even find fragments of habitat sometime. Just the vastness of these intact wetlands flying into Sorimo were incredible. Um, Being in places that are really degraded can be kind of uh, demoralizing. Working in places like Madagascar or Burundi and Tanzania. Um, but this trip to Angola is, I think, the first time where I actually saw endless intact habitat. So this area is pretty special. As you get closer to Sorimo, lots of mining activities, which are a big threat to the region. This huge open pit mine, and you can see the sediment washing into the rivers. That river is completely filled with sediment, destroyed all the wetlands around it. Um, as these landmines are getting removed and areas are becoming safer to develop, um, a lot of these places are getting pretty disturbed. But the habitat I was able to find near Sorimo was pretty spectacular. A lot of these slow-moving rivers with riverside gallery forests. You can even see at the bottom this sphagnum growing in the middle of the river. And that's where I found the first couple undescribed species. And so during a lot of this trip, I was getting total surprises. A lot of these things have never been collected before, even though I knew a ton of herbarium specimens from Angola. Um, I wasn't aware of just how diverse Drosera were there. And so this first species on the right is an aquatic species. And I know of one other aquatic species that I'll show you later. Um, but this guy occupies a similar niche in shallower water, slower moving. And I was also at this site able to find the one I went up there for. So this really strange species with the broad petioles. That's my favorite kind. Um, I was really lucky to find this guy. Probably one of my favorites from the trip, in spite of being kind of pale green and ugly. That leaf shape is just so unique. And there's its herbarium specimen that dragged me out to Sorimo. Lots of cool habitat near Sorimo. Again, these gallery forests that go right to the water, really unique. We didn't see that anywhere else in Angola. And on some drier slopes, I was able to find that other one. And this one turned out to be one that I had actually seen before in DRC. And this wasn't really on my radar of possibilities just due to the difference in elevation. Um, in DRC, I saw this one at around 2,000 meters, and this one in Sarima was from 900 meters. So I was surprised to see it. I had thought it was a high elevation species. I also found this guy. At some point, we had to start giving them pretty silly nicknames just to try to keep track of them. And so this was something I was calling small red fuzzy. Um, and so it's small, often red and fuzzy, and it has these really cool, uh, huge stipules. Another plant that brought me up to Sorimo, and really the timing of this trip, I had centered around this plant and its flowering time, was Drosera compacta. And Drosera compacta, after publication, was pretty quickly synonymized with Drosera bequerdii. And so if you look at specimens of Drosera bequerdii, or those labeled Drosera bequerdii, um, you get two flavors, right? You get these guys with the upturned leaves, and you get these guys with the reflex leaves. They're really easy to tell apart from the herbarium specimens. And so these ones on the right are Drosera compacta. And in order to make sure that they were in fact two separate species, I really wanted to go see them in the field. That body plan holds true. In living plants, that's Drosera bequerdii from DRC. And so trying to find my mouse here. Man, nope. All right. So to get to Drosera compacta, it's on the south end of the map. It's pretty much near Calamba. And so I had to drive from Sarimo at the very north of the map down to Calamba, and the stretch from Luena on the bottom left corner to Calamba is a pure sand pit. And so it was a long, long drive getting stuck in the sand. And at one point, about 40 kilometers from the site, our truck broke down. And this was my only day to look for Drosera compacta. And so I had to hop on one of these motorbikes and spend the rest of the day 40 kilometers to the Drosera compacta site. Probably one of the scariest things I've ever done, and I never want to do it again. But it was definitely worth it to see these things in the flesh. Were pretty incredible. This was a really amazing species, and the population was huge. There were hundreds of plants in this kind of seasonally dry peaty savanna. And you can see those reflexed leaves that Drosera biquardii doesn't have. And so these guys go dormant after flowering, and they'll reemerge around November when the rains come. And this was the habitat. It looks like a pretty terrible habitat, and if I didn't have coordinates for this, I don't think I would have looked for Drosera here. But these grasses ended up being a lot more open underneath than they look. Then I was able to fly back to Luanda and meet up with everybody else. Um, And so thanks, Fernando, for the photo. So Fernando, Noah, myself, William Way, and Damien Juan. Pretty quickly after meeting up, we got a flat tire, but the locals stopped immediately and are super helpful. Damien and these guys got us back in the road probably within an hour. And the next day, we hit our first site. And so we stopped by this really cool Inselberg habitat. So these just giant, usually granitic rocks, and a lot of seepages come down them. So you can kind of see the stains where the seepages had flowed. These are always seasonal seepages. And so you find a really specific cohort of annual plants or plants that can survive a really dry dormancy. Usually when you see Drosera indica, for example, you see it in these kind of Inselberg habitats. But we saw things like Utricularia welwitschii, Utricularia trupinii, which was really cool. This used to be thought to be a Burundi, Rwanda endemic. But last year I found it all the way in Zambia. This year, Angola. So this thing is a lot more widespread than we previously thought, which is good for this guy because I think it's still on the IUCN is listed as critically endangered. Also Drosera burkeyana, which either grow as annuals or die back to the root during the dry season. Just south of there, we found this guy, which I was calling Drosera species Zambia too. I first saw this thing in Zambia, and you run out of nicknames at some point. But this species is really cool. It's really robust, pretty pubescent. On our way heading towards Menongwe, we found this guy. We found it next to a cornfield, so we were calling this one Drosera species cornfield. There's no captions because I don't want these nicknames to stick. This was really cool. Pretty large species. We also found one of my favorites, another undescribed species. We were calling this one tall congolana, um, really pubescent, has these amazing pubescent scapes. And it's kind of similar to Drosera congolana, but Drosera congolana doesn't form a stem. It's a lot smaller, maybe a third of the size. And just this thing was just so hairy. Um, both sides of the petiole, the inflorescence, such a cool species. So many cool species in this one valley. We were giving them a million nicknames. We have robust green. We have scrawny green. Just the diversity was amazing. Drosera affinis, one of the few species we found that actually has a name. Drosera affinis usually grows on the edges of lakes. This undescribed species, soon to be described. Drosera flexicalis, one of four species that have names on this strip. And in this river valley, we found more Drosera compacta. So all of my motorbike drama was for nothing. We found these gorgeous plants growing in almost pure sand in a drier area above the river. This was like a 600-kilometer range extension for this species. The species only been collected 3 times previously. Another big goal was this guy, who worked in Angola in the 1800s, um, didn't describe, but wrote up as Drosera hematypes, and he pasted his description on his herbarium specimen, and it was never published. Um, and so we were able to find that guy, a pretty perfect match. And so this will have to be described, and we'll keep the name as Drosera hematypes. Really cool species, closely related to Drosera catongensis, Drosera elongata. So it has some seasonality, dying back and reemerging from the roots. A really unique kind of yellow color. Some lentibulariaceae. The big goal of this trip was Genlisea pallida, um, which is only very rarely observed. It was only rediscovered a few years ago by the team working on National Geographic's Okavango Wilderness Project, and they were exploring um, the source of the Okavango, which is the area we're in, and they found this guy and also Genlisea angolensis. These guys were super cool, had really glandular inflorescences, and they were always growing in kind of um, cool running water. Genlisea margarete growing in almost pure sand. It was a really unique habitat to find them in. Growing with some Xyrus, Drosera burkiana, and Utricularia reflexa growing in just a really thin film of water, famous for its huge traps, almost poking out of the water. At this site, we also found this really cool form of Utricularia welwitschii, maybe an undescribed species, but really unique coloration, kind of this bicolor um, or tricolor. Lower corolla was reddish, and then a purple top, yellow center, really unique. And it grew with the normal purple and yellow Utricularia welwitschii. Also, Utricularia spiralis, which is a really cool species, named for its twining habitat or habit around the grasses. And these guys were just cool, so cool to see, like a deep blue. Not many habitat shots because the habitats look like this. It was a lot of grass. So all these wetlands in the deeper pockets, we were able to find this weird little thing, which is a new aquatic utricularia, had really unique flowers that poked above the water and kind of an open flower plan. So you only see this in Utricularia cymbantha, um, at least in Africa. Utricularia falcata. It's maybe the second time this thing's been photographed. But what we were really looking for was Genlisea angolensis. And so we looked at this small tributary of a larger river, and along the margins in cooler flowing water, we were able to find this enormous species of Genlisea with relatively smaller flowers. And thanks, Damien, for the picture. Just to show how huge these rosettes are, it was really impressive. Coming from someone who isn't that interested in Genlisea, they were pretty cool to see. And that riverside habitat allowed us to get a really good look at the traps, which is pretty rare for Genlisea. They're really fragile. When they're growing more terrestrially, these traps always break off. They're really hard to see, but these traps were enormous. Growing with them, this other aquatic Drosera, that if you're growing Drosera madagascariensis, you're probably growing this thing, at least in cultivation, is definitely more common than Drosera madagascariensis. So all of those coming from Okavango or Botswana, that's this guy here. And these guys were so impressive. They grew in huge colonies, massive plants, lining the rivers. And they're easily, I would say, the largest Drosera in Africa. So there's Noah and I showing you guys how huge they are. And so then we headed west to Lubango. I don't have a mouse to show you, so letter I on the map on the lower left. And Lubango is totally different from these tropical savannas that we were in before. So Lubango is a lot higher elevation. So we're going from what was around 1,500 meters to now 2,000, 2,100 meters. Um, and so a lot more seasonality, stronger, wetter, drier seasons. And so here we saw a different cohort of species. We found Drosera curvipes again, which was really unexpected. So now we have this Drosera curvipes coming from South Africa, Burundi, and then Angola. A super bizarre distribution, but always at around 2,000 meters. This Utricularia, which we can really key out, something close to Utricularia welwitschii, but with flowers 3 times the size and usually just a few flowers. Maybe Utricularia odontosepala, but the sepals weren't quite right. We also found this relative of Drosera pilosa, but with really long glandular hairs only inflorescences. And my favorite, Utricularia pentadactyla, a really tiny form of Genlisea africana. So definitely living as an annual, coming in both white and purple forms. This strange, potentially undescribed Utricularia, something close to Reflexa, but huge inflorescences that twined around the grasses. And after Lubongo, we drove down to the coast so that we could see this famous guy, Welwitschia. Really cool plant growing in the Namib Desert. Everybody flew back to Luanda except for Noah and I. We had to return the car, so driving from Lubongo to Luanda. But Noah and I wanted to see if we could find Drosera congolana. So we drove from Lubongo all the way to the DRC border at the top there um, to see if we could catch some of that lower elevation habitat and find some of the same species that are near Kinshasa, DRC on the other side. On our way up there, we found this strange species, another undescribed, probably one of the coolest undescribed species we found on this trip. And we got super lucky, saved me a trip to Kinshasa and found Drosera congolana. So these really compact species with a really hairy inflorescence. So in total, good timing. We got 32 draws for 28 of which were undescribed or synonymized, 25 Utricularia, and 5 Genlisea. So an incredible amount of diversity just in Angola. Um, so many people were involved, especially in Angola. But I have to say thanks to everybody I could remember. So Dr. Joel Ndayishimiye from the University of Burundi, Dr. Fernando Lages, who helped me tremendously with collecting permits in Angola, the Moyer family and Andrea Bianchi in Tanzania, the Moyer family, especially for their just amazing stewardship of that place in the Kipengiri Mountains, but for allowing me to come survey their property. A lot of people who helped me with records and logistics. Telmo Antonio from the Nat Geo Okavango Wilderness Project helped me a ton with permits in Angola and exported my specimens for me. Angola, the issue with landmines, we had to send all of our sites to the Halo Trust, which oversees landmine removal, and Peter Coles of the Halo Trust told me which of my sites were safe, which of my sites were covered with landmines, where I couldn't go, where I could go. It would have been impossible without that kind of insight. David Goiter at Kew Gardens for help with his records. Manfred Fink at the University of Hamburg for help with his records, especially Drosera compacta that he rediscovered. Um, the chief at Chitembo, my fake taxi drivers in Sarimo, that middle picture, Burundi crew on the left. So many people involved in these trips. The logistics are just insane to arrange something like this. But thanks, guys. I think we have like 10 minutes for questions or something.
All right, thank you, Alex. Um, if I could just talk about the ICPS for 2 minutes, and then I'm going to read you some of the questions that are in the chat box.
Wait, let me talk about the ICPS first. Huge thanks to the ICPS for especially the Burundi and Tanzania portion of this trip. Um, they funded a significant portion of that work, which would have been impossible otherwise. Um, these expeditions can get insanely expensive, especially the vehicles. So that kind of support, especially for this basic research, is super important. So thanks to you guys, especially for um, people who are members, those funds go to things like that. So that's a huge help.
Exactly. So we encourage everyone to become a ICPS member because that is how we fund our conservation and education initiatives. Next month, I just made this and I realized that it's the wrong month, but in August 14th, the Carnivorous Plant Club of Toronto will be doing a webinar for us. We encourage everyone to follow us on our YouTube page where we post all of our past webinars. We have an active Facebook group, Facebook forum, and Instagram account. If you go to carnivorousplants.org, you can learn more about becoming a member. We also have growing guides for all the different taxonomic ranges. Every August, we have a carnivorous plants in the classroom grant opportunity for K through 12 teachers. So you should go and check that out. And if you know a teacher, share that resource with them. And every other year, we have an international conference. The 15th ICPS conference will be in the Netherlands, August 21 to 25 in the year 2026. And we hope to see you there. Okay, Alex.
Yes, if anybody has any questions.
Yeah, I'm going to read you the questions, and then at the end, I'll allow them to unmute themselves. Okay, Benjamin says, how do you access these African herbarium specimens? Have they all been digitalized?
Mm.
Digitized.
Yeah, so a lot of them have been digitized. You can see a lot of specimens on gbif.org, so GBIF. That's just a fraction of digitized specimens. So whenever I'm in a country, the first place to go is always the herbarium, just because, especially in Africa, those specimens usually aren't digitized, and you can usually find some really cool things in there. The few times I went at the end of the trip, I always regretted it because there's always something cool where I'm like, ah, I should have went there too. Um, but yeah, gbif.org has a lot of them.
Ben asks, were you using Landsat images to identify potential habitats in the cultivated, fragmented areas in the lowlands, or were you able to access more high-res images?
I was using Google Maps, yeah, so just satellite imagery. Um, at this point, I'm pretty more or less good at finding, being able to recognize what's a disturbed habitat and what is good carnivorous plant habitat, which is a huge learning curve in tropical Africa. But I got extremely lucky. I mean, it might have helped that in at least in Burundi and Tanzania, there's almost no habitat left. So that really narrowed it down. But I spent hours um, just going like inch by inch across the map looking for roadside seepages and things like that. I do that when I'm bored a lot.
Nick asks, do the locals have a name for the sundews?
I don't know, but they oftentimes were aware of them. So like in at that Katongensis site in Tanzania, um, some locals walked through when I was photographing and were kind of asking what I was doing, and I showed them the plant, and they were explaining to each other that, oh yeah, that plant is all in that wetland. They always see it. So these people are always working with their hands with the plants, whether it's clearing the habitat or what. Um, they're definitely aware of what's out there, even if there isn't a word for that specific plant.
Jimin asks, why are so many African sundews stem forming?
I think that has to do with just, I mean, the habitat. If you look back at the typical habitat for these species, I mean, it's just so many grasses. Um, and so they really have to compete for light, for one thing, with these grasses that get taller and taller as the fire cycle goes on. So these usually burn in the dry season, open things up. The Drosera will bloom then, while there's less competition. And then the Drosera will persist as they get crowded out by the grasses, you usually find them really etiolated. But that stemming helps them kind of keep up with those grasses and also get their inflorescence above the grasses.
Sundew Matt asks, is there any way to get these plants protected so their populations aren't destroyed? William Way adds, to be honest, it seems inevitable. We stumbled across a truck full of peat miners working at one of the sites we visited in Angola.
Yeah, probably the most incredible site, which was this river valley called Kapangana. We pulled up to the side of the road at the exact same moment. Some Vietnamese company pulled up to the side of the road, and we got out and we were like, they were like, "Oh, what are you guys doing here?" We're like, "Oh, we're looking for plants in the peat bogs. What are you guys doing here?" They're like, "Oh, we're looking to harvest peat, so we're looking to source peat." So um, this amazing bog that we kind of converged on. I mean, there were over 20 species of Drosera in this one bog, and then including rare things like Genlisea pallida. It was an incredible place. Whether or not there's something we can do to preserve it, um, that I don't know. I think it'd have to start from like a local initiative.
Ben asks, have you checked the sterility of the presumed hybrids of the Burundi species?
Yes, so that hybrid between Crevipes and that round, I have too many slides, wherever it is, they're completely sterile. So I found it at three different sites and I couldn't find a single seed. It was really strange, but yeah, I'm pretty sure it's a hybrid. I'm gonna run about 300 samples for phylogenetic analysis as part of my thesis. So that'll be one I include, but that analysis will be able to show any kind of evidence of hybridization.
Would you have an estimate of how much it costs to buy acres of land, Sandy? Casey would like to know.
I have no idea. I wish because it's such a great thing in your head, right? Like to buy all these awesome sites, but I think due to the nature of the sites, they're so dependent on these rivers and the hydrology that it's hard to, I don't know, kind of like fence off a chunk of it and expect it to be intact when there's things like mining or water diversion happening around it that affect the hydrology and nutrient flow. Um, and so, yeah, I think it's challenging. I really don't know a ton about conservation. My part in this is that I need to slap names on them first. Before I started that, I mean, I'm up to like maybe 80 undescribed species. Um, we had no idea about the diversity of Drosera in Africa, and we're still finding a ton of new things every time we're out. Um, and so I think as that progresses, then we can talk about how special these areas are um, with units, which in conservation are species.
All right, because of time, I'll do one more question from Sandy Casey as well. How else can we help donate to research like this? And I'll say from the ICPS perspective, usually around the end of the year for tax reasons, people will donate several thousands of dollars for the education bucket or the conservation bucket. And then Carson Trexler, who's the conservation director, he will receive several applications from different universities around the world saying, hey, we have this project in mind. And we do not always have enough funds to fund every project that we receive. So that's one way. And then Alex, you're associated with the university.
Yeah, I'm at Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich, Germany, and um, I fund my own field work through my work as a high school biology teacher. But around the time of an expedition, I'm usually selling something from seeds to plants or whatever. So that's an awesome way to support me when it happens. Um, I don't have any expeditions planned right now, so I don't have um, any kind of way to support me right now. Thanks, though.
All right, I'll read one last comment from Sundu Matt. If Charles Darwin was alive today, he would be very proud of you and he would be over 200 years old.
Yes, he famously said he cares about Drosera more than the origin of any species in the world, and I use that on maybe any talk I give to the general public just to throw his name out there. But yeah, he was also a Sundu nerd.
All right. Well, thank you everyone who attended this live. Thank you so much, Alex. I'm going to stop recording. And Alex, if you could stay for like just 5 to 10 more minutes, I'm going to allow everyone to unmute themselves and they'll be able to ask you a question or two off the recording. So
Totally.
thank you very much.
It's not a surprise that gardeners, educators, and scientists are fascinated by these unique plants. The International Carnivorous Plant Society, or ICPS, not only love these plants, but welcomes growers just getting started all the way through professional scientists. The ICPS even started an annual World Carnivorous Plant Day to celebrate them. The free online event is held the first Wednesday of May. Take a look around our website and you'll find historic documents about carnivorous plants, growing guides, free educational resources, and more. Have questions? Ask. We don't bite, but our plants do.